was on the panel in the ag. I didn't do anything, thank goodness, I didn't have any workshops, making work in the room, but then I had the intro for just food, and I had to be on, I had to do an interview, and then I had to be on a panel, so I was like, yesterday I couldn't do anything, I was just too tired.
And then we forced you to come here.
I don't know, I don't understand how he got, because he called me like desperate, because I was teaching and finally he said, "We haven't heard from you," and I said, "Wait a second," and I sent my stuff, I said I was coming, I sent my bio, I said, "I put your bio, whatever you asked for," and then, have you heard from Mary Taylor? And I said, "No, what give me an information?" But we didn't know, because he said, "Well, we figured you're not coming." That's what he said. We didn't hear from him, so we assumed you're not coming, so.
Yeah, I guess you were replying to him, and he
Right.
thought that you were replying all, so he thought I was getting your replies. Hey, good, how are you? Mark, this is good.
Hi, Mark.
Hi.
I'm in Washington.
Pleasure's mine.
Now about her.
Yeah.
So, Eric will be back in a minute. Waiving the right to not allow us to broadcast like this. He came to make amends.
Good. What just helps? Huh? Don't hold back. This is skydiving.
Good. All right, fingers crossed. Thanks.
Hearing. But they got the camera on, they got the camera on, and the politicians carrying out.
Right, and just three hands.
It's talking about America.
What's the other one? C-SPAN.
That's what I meant.
Yeah.
That's what I meant.
Okay, so then, yeah, because Aaron very likely will have more to say after, right? So what we'll do is, you're gonna. Right?
I'll say something, yeah, say
You
what I
know, then Eric will, yeah,
All right.
and then I guess we'll have Mark comment, and then if you want to comment again, and then we'll open it up. Okay. Does that make sense? If you want to. And do you want to take the moderated comments with you? Okay. So I think
We have peeps.
we have the people. What time is it right now?
What time is this supposed to start? At 6?
6.
Yeah, so let's give another few minutes. Let's try to, also because class is at 6.
Oh, so 56 meeting?
Exactly.
You know he's funny.
No, oh my goodness.
He's funny.
Nice. look good out in Redmond. She's coming Saturday. She's gonna be, at the work there. What are you leaving?
Mostly coming out of the but that's, the events are.
Yeah, but not used to be.
Really?
Are they,
Which I was one of the first people who was $10. Started an
Uh-huh.
organization. But,
She's doing
yeah, we've been really busy, trying to have this group of Black urban growers, and so we've been really trying to push the envelope.
It's actually a conference. Black Farmers
In
Conference.
October?
Yeah.
Heck yeah. When we get started, I want to talk about that. Oh, this is Steve. So you know Jane Hart. So it's Steve and Jane and Carla and Maggie. We kind of think, well, let's get back to you on. Let's get on. So we've been doing this, we've been doing this work for a long time. And people go to conferences every see. Oh, really? Oh, please, thank you so much. Thank you very much. And, I'll be seeing
Right.
you.
It's the only one. Yeah, because it's, it's like this little desert, so whenever they come here. Yeah. Yeah, the plants, I feel really good about it.
And the person that is listening to us will
Right, but there's no reason.
no reason. Was a lot more than that. Two of the participants at this big, new phone call that's happening in the state. It's for large scale farming, so it's not small scale, so that that makes a lot of sense. Then I said, well, people should be up there. Science. So you get out.
Yeah, it seems like a really smart guy.
So then, always got big enough and bold enough to say, well,
Yeah, it was just like
we have to first make sure that the farmers' children,
this
we first do it. So,
another
I
plan.
can't say no farm workers, farm children. So right then and there, I just really what the flavor was. But anyway, I was going, we had taken a bus ride to look at her stage. And I had to see what's his name. He was, ever since he was in, his job was to, we're trying to preserve land. So I tell him, I'm in work with one, so we're trying to preserve land in the city, So that's how we got to do it. So that's how And,
So I got confused, but average. So, so I had to strip everything out of it because I couldn't see that.
Yeah, I was thinking about
It's much smaller, like here. We're gonna do that in simple part. So that'll add. So there's no, you know, they still need to a few seats, but we don't advertise it more. We should filter it. Turns out, Georgia class is just helpful. Comments made by Greeks in the crowd. You know, because
yeah.
right, there's this whole reparation part.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Well, it's, I mean, coincidence. It's just saying, don't be surprised.
it was not even stuck.
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of like being weird, but they something kind of stuff. It's important.
So it's four.
There's other people.
So right now, we're
The hiring
with
process.
the rehab, so we just ordering plans.
You guys also learn.
Doing, trades, we just finished ordering, flowers, tomatoes, this and that. So we had to tell about the people that got to do a market.
Yeah.
I don't know, I just looked at that, I all of a sudden this went from like 5 places to like 10.
Right.
Peppers, potatoes.
Yeah. We know. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah. 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 Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Let's get it.
Here's,
You want that,
is that back up? I said, maybe a minute and I back up.
No, she's not that type of.
Which we are on it.
No.
Advocacy class, law school, and, so, first of all, guest
Where'd you
speakers
see?
at the Justice Law Firm. That's another thing. But it's so good. I have a lot of understanding. Guest speakers are good. And then, so, first was Dr. Bernard.
She's from.
And she does work around
Basically.
and she
Yeah. Yeah. Storage. No, just, yeah, the best is international.
then,
Some framing, the directors. Yeah.
And practically rent-free, their own space that's waterfront space. And then the next people we have is,
Oh, yeah.
and
Nancy.
she,
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
She's
Oh my God, it's whole set of funds, but I'm
excellent. And
Just
so
all over.
it's so important, and then
Communication.
communication, messaging, and yesterday was my, who was just,
In a good way, yeah.
director of policy, Lazio administration. And then next week, we have Diana Robertson, you know Diana Robertson? Diana Robertson, she's from Who Workers Alliance.
Oh, yeah.
And Suzanne Bass from Wyoming. And then the last class, the 21st, they do a presentation, we have them. Advocacy conversation, very, and then, class, they have to do a campaign. It's 6 weeks, and it runs from. It's really good.
I worked for 4 years.
Asked to do it.
Some organizing.
Last minute, like 3 years ago, a friend of mine was doing it, and then the last, like, before the class.
Yeah. There's something dangerous. Folks.
Something that overnight, so you can, the students make some, you can sit down, give some sort of guidance in terms of what happens about. It's the conversation. Enthusiasm. This class looks
doesn't want to teach me
and so now I see them galvanized and hear them speak to the just food conference. Class is very good speakers. I find, I feel it's good. There's a light at the end of the tunnel.
They gotta get the farming right.
He grew up in Sussex. Yes, yeah.
You guys question?
Oh, we're gonna go see.
Yeah, when you get up here, just introduce you all, and then you'll take over. Okay.
Oh,
Greetings, everyone. Thanks for being patient. I wanted to make sure everyone could get here to class. My name is Mary Taylor. I'm the Assistant Director of the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics. I hope you all know about us. If you're interested in finding out more, our website is pcp.cuny.edu. You can also sign up on the homepage there if you want to receive information about our other events. So we are live streaming tonight. I want to warn you, so anything that you say will be recorded and live streamed and will show up eventually on our website. And I do want to announce a related event that is tomorrow. The title is Food Futures, Critical Perspectives. It's a roundtable, the main speakers of which are Joel Berg from the New York Coalition Against Hunger and Smita Narula from the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College.
Mary, that's Friday.
Oh, I'm sorry. I said tomorrow. I meant Friday, which is the 20th. And that is, do you know where that is, Mark?
It's in the sea level of this building. I don't remember the room.
So it's in the sea level of this building, which is the basement, and it'll be at 4:15 p.m. Is that right, Mark? That's the anthropology colloquium. So if you forget any of the vague information I just gave you, you can go to the website of the anthropology department to get the exact information on that. So today's conversation is called Dismantling Racism in the Food System. And I have next to me here Karen Washington, Mark Edelman, and Eric Holt Jimenez. And I'm going to read their bios to you so you'll know a bit about them. And then Karen's going to speak first. She's going to introduce her thoughts on the topic. Eric will follow, and Mark will pick up towards the end. So Karen Washington has lived in New York City all of her life and has been a resident of the Bronx for over 26 years. Since 1985, she's been a community activist striving to make the New York City a better place to live. As a community gardener and board member of the New York Botanical Gardens, Karen has worked with Bronx neighborhoods to turn empty lots into community gardens. As an advocate, she has stood up and spoken out for garden protection and preservation. As a member of the La Familia Verde Garden Coalition, she helped launch City Farms Market, bringing garden fresh vegetables to her neighbors. Karen is a Just Food board member and a Just Food trainer, leading workshops on growing food and food justice to community gardeners all over the city. Karen's also a board member and former president of the New York City Community Garden Coalition, a group founded to preserve community gardens. She also co-founded Black Urban Growers, BUGS, an organization of volunteers committed to building networks and community support for growers in both urban and rural settings. In 2012, Ebony Magazine voted her one of the 100 most influential African Americans in the country. And last year, she was the recipient of the 2014 James Beard Leadership Award. Karen has professionally been a physical therapist for 37 years, balancing her professional life with community service. Since retiring in April, congratulations, she plans on pursuing her passion for farming full-time. So Karen Washington. Next to Karen is Mark Edelman. Mark Edelman's research and writing have focused on agrarian issues, social movements, and a variety of Latin American topics, including the historical roots of nationalism and contemporary politics. Most of his work has dealt with changing land tenure and land use patterns, production systems, rural class relations, and social movements in Central America. He has a long-standing concern with outstanding changing forms of capitalism and with the politics of controlling markets, whether through welfare states, civil society pressure, or global trade rules. During the mid-1980s, after seeing his fieldwork zone in northern Costa Rica tragically converted into a staging area for the civil war in Nicaragua, he also carried out research in the USSR and wrote extensively on Soviet Latin American relations. Currently, Edelman is working on a project supported by the National Science Foundation and the PSC CUNY Grants Program on the efforts of transnational agrarian movements to have the United Nations approve a declaration on the rights of peasants. He's also completing a book on the peasant involvement in global civil society movements and transnational networking among small farmer organizations. He has served on the editorial boards of American Anthropologist, American Ethnologists, Anuario de Estudios Centroamericanos, Critique of Anthropology, Cuadernos de Antropología, Culture and Agriculture, Food and Environment, Focal, Journal of Global and Historical Anthropology, the Journal of Agrarian Change, Journal of Latin American Anthropology, the Journal of Peasant Studies, Latin American Research Review, NACLA Report on the Americas, Revue Classe, and Studies in Comparative International Development. Long list. My last speaker here over on the left, last but not least, is Eric Colt Jimenez. He is the Executive Director of Food First since 2006. He's the editor of the Food First book, Food Movements Unite, Strategies to Transform Our Food Systems, co-author of Food Rebellions, Crisis and the Hunger for Justice, with Raj Patel and Annie Shattuck, and author of the book Campesino a Campesino, Voices from Latin America's Farmer-to-Farmer Movement for Sustainable Agriculture, and of many academic magazine and news articles. Of Basque and Puerto Rican heritage, Eric grew up milking cows and pitching hay in Point Reyes, California, where he learned that putting food on the table is hard work. After studying rural education and biology at the University of Oregon and Evergreen State College, he traveled through Mexico and Central America, where he was drawn to the simple life of small-scale farmers. So just one last fact on that long list is that Eric and Mark were both part of a team that edited a recent 40th anniversary issue of the Journal of Peasant Studies, which is entitled Critical Perspectives on Food Sovereignty. This will be out as a book in May. And Eric and Mark are among the co-authors of the introduction of that. And then Eric is also one of the co-editors of a forthcoming journal issue on food sovereignty in the Third World Quarterly. So those are things you can look out for. Okay, Karen Washington, thanks for being here.
It's up to you. You can stay down there or you can come up here, whatever makes you feel.
Yes, so this topic, dismantling racism in the food system. Folks, we got a lot of work to do. I've been doing this work for over 28 years. I started in the Bronx. I live in the Bronx. It's one of the poorest in the nation, Congressional District 17. The median income of family four is $24,000 a year. We are laced with fast foods, processed food, and junk food. And so when I came into this movement, I looked around and I wanted to see people who sort of looked like me. I wanted to be able to see who were the people who had the power. And starting off with empty lots and looking at one time, New York City had over 15,000 vacant lots. Where were those lots? Well, they were mostly in low-income neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color. And I found out quickly that people who had money left and people that did not have the money stayed. And those people that stayed took a lot of the challenges. At that time, crack cocaine was prevalent. Back in the early 80s, prostitution, crime. And so you had a bunch of people who had to band together and to change those empty lots into community gardens. Those gardeners, to this day, have made those neighborhoods look good, but as a result of them looking good, we have a problem of gentrification and displacement. The number one, I think, problem that we had back then and still is silence and complacency. Back then when you were building your gardens and you thought you were doing something great, you figured you were doing something for the city. You were making your neighborhoods look good, you were deterring crime, but yet the powers that be thought differently and tried to auction off those 100 community gardens. And as a result, that sort of air of complacency had to change and go into activism. And so you had to teach a group of people this sort of civic 101 in terms of who had the power. Because land in cities is tied to politics. And understanding who had the power. Because for too long, we were thought of as powerless. We were thought that the politicians were the ones that had the power, and the people who were in our communities didn't have the power. So we had to educate our people the power, first of all, of voting and what that meant. And I say that because in order for us to get some sort of revenue, we had to find out exactly who had the power and who had the money. And what politicians were doing is that they were going through communities and finding out that those that did vote got more money and those that did not vote did not get any money. So we had to galvanize people and do community organizing, getting them to understand the power of voting. That people with the power of voting can change things. We also had to understand that in the political system, that you had sort of steps that you had to, and leadership that you had to keep accountable. So you had your council person, you had your assembly person, you had your senator, and you had your congressman. And so teaching people to go after these political people in such a way to make them accountable gave people power. Another lesson that we learned was the fact that when you own land, it gives you power. When you're in control of your food system, it gives you power. And so this food movement has transcended me because of the fact that many of us feel powerless. And I say that because of the fact that we don't feel that we do have the power, that food is tied to political authority. And I say that because I look around and I find that the people who own land are not people that look like me. That people who have resources are not people who look like me. That people who have wealth are not people who look like me. So when we talk about this food movement, we have to talk about it in terms of the power of land and the power of resources and wealth. And so as I move through this chain of this food movement, I've also noticed that the narrative has changed as well. That when people talk about the food movement through the eyes of urban agriculture, is that the people who did stay in the very beginning are being displaced, that the narrative is now being changed in such a way that it dismisses the people that were here in the very beginning, and is now centered on people who don't look like me. And so we are really going to be intentional about this food movement. We have to understand, number one, who has the power. And the people with the power don't look like me. If we really want to see this food movement go further, we have to understand who are the leaders in this food movement. And the leaders don't look like me. If you look at the majority of the nonprofits in the food movement, the leaderships are mostly white. They're not people of color. Yet the people that work and do the work in the movement are the people of color. When you look at the money and funding that's given to organizations in the food movement, they're mostly white. The people that are doing the work in the food movement look like me, and those resources are next to nil. I broadened my horizon again to look at the movement from the seed to the plate, and looked at the people in the field that were doing the work. And the people who were doing the work, that were planting the seeds, looked like me. But yet the recognition of the farmer did not look like me. They were majority of them were white. If you go along the chain and look at the people who had the power in distribution, processing, restaurants, again, they were mostly white. But yet the people that were doing the work were people who looked like me. And so, as I travel along this pattern of the food movement, I finally realized that we're at a point where, when people say the system is broken, I say it's not broken, it's intentional. That the food system is intentionally racist. That there's been patterns of structural racism and institutional racism. I often say that money is being made on the backs of people who are poor and people who are black and brown. And I say that because most of the people who are sick are poor. Most of the people who don't have resources are black and brown. But yet, the powers that be, the structures that are in place, are people who are white. So how do we shift this food movement in such a way that people understand their racism, that people understand their privilege, that people understand that in order for us to really be involved in this movement and to shift it in such a way that is supposed to be inclusive, that people have to share that power, they have to share their resources, and that's a scary thing. That's a scary thing if you have power and you have money and all of a sudden you have to give it up and you have to share it. Can you imagine the nonprofits that are here in the city? How would they look like if in the leadership position people were black and brown? If the people in the neighborhoods who are gentrified are now in power and now own their land and own their homes, how would that look like? How would that look like if we're able to share power in such a way that the people who for so long have been marginalized are given that power and given that wealth? As this country becomes more black and brown, and it's getting there, things are going to change. I see the light at the end of the tunnel, and I say that because for too long people have been pushed and pushed and pushed. And the only way that this food movement is going to change is through resistance. Two critical things that we must overcome is complacency and silence. And I want to see people, and I'm talking about my white counterparts, to be more active and proactive. It's good to come to these conferences and workshops and speak the words of food justice and social justice and equity, but unless there's action behind those words, nothing will be done. So for me, in this food movement of 28 years, I want to see a shift. I want to see a shift in a movement whereby my white counterparts will come up to the plate and give up their leadership positions. That the nonprofits who have been working at their jobs for 10, 15, 20 years, stating that they are going to empower communities of color and promote leadership step down and hand over those reins to people of color. I want to see the political system change in such a way that the leadership and the narrative is from the voices of people of color. I want people who have been for so long been comfortable, I want to make them feel uncomfortable. Because when you feel that you're uncomfortable, you are creating change. One last thing I want to say to our young people out there. You have a chance to change the dynamics and the narrative of this food system. It's in your hands now. If you really feel that you want to dismantle racism, that you want to see a more inclusive food system, then you need to get off your butts and do something about it. Talk is cheap. I've seen talk. I know what talk looks like. I want to see action. I want to see change. I want to see people sharing their power and giving up their power. I want to see people sharing their resources and promoting more leadership amongst brown and black people and women. That's it.
Thank you, Karen. I guess I want to make the point, following Karen's point, of why this is important to everybody, why dismantling racism in the food system is in the benefit of all of society, why white people of privilege have a stake in dismantling racism in the food system, why our food system is unsustainable because of its inequity, and why, if we want a healthy, sustainable food system, the first thing we have to do is to dismantle racism in the food system. And I want to talk about why this is hard. It's hard because if it was easy, many of us would have already done it. Why it's held in place, why it appears to be invisible to so many people, and what we can do about it. So, I just want to mention that my remarks are going to come from this perspective of Food First, the Institute for Food and Development Policy. We're a think tank. We do research and development. We try to partner with social movements around the world, including in the United States. We try to raise up the voices and amplify the experiences of people who are on the front lines transforming the food system. And we try to analyze the food system in ways so that the general public can understand why the food system acts the way it does, why it's structured the way it is, and what we can do about it. We've been doing this work for 40 years. We were started by an extraordinary woman named Frances Moore LePay, who wrote Diet for a Small Planet 40 years ago. And in that book, Frances Moore LePay said something which at the time was revolutionary. There were something like 650 million hungry people around the world 40 years ago. And everybody believed that this was because there wasn't enough food to go around. But in her research, what Frances Moore LePay discovered that there was 1.5 times enough food to feed every man, woman, and child on the planet. And yet millions of people were going hungry. 40 years later, we have the same situation. We have 1.5 times enough food to feed every man, woman, and child on the planet, and yet we have 1 billion people going hungry. In the United States, the richest country in the world, produces more food than any other country except perhaps China. We have 50 million hungry people. And who are these people? And why are they hungry in the richest country in the world? So the point that I want to make, the argument I want to make, is that if we want to transform our food system, which clearly is not working well for everybody, we're going to have to dismantle racism in the food system. And this means that if we want our food system to be just, we actually need food justice. And how do we do food justice? I think there's a lot to be celebrated. Over the last 15, 20 years in the United States, a very vibrant food movement has risen up. To the rise of organic farming, the rise of farmers markets, school gardens, farm-to-school programs, community-supported agriculture, food hubs, urban farms. These things are breaking through the asphalt all across our country. And they get a lot of press. Food writers, food celebrities write about this vibrant food movement. And they should. And we should be happy about this. But I think that if we care as much about food as we care about people, if we care as much about people as we care about food, we're going to have to ask ourselves a couple of hard questions. If this food movement is so great, how come everybody isn't doing it? Why is it that 1 in 7 people in the United States are going hungry? How is it that we still have food insecurity and 50 million people not getting enough food? And how is it that they're not getting the right food? Why is it that people of color suffer the highest rates of diet-related diseases? Why is it that they suffer the highest rates of food insecurity? Why is it that immigrants suffer such highest rates of food insecurity and diet-related disease? And why is it that the food workers in this country, from farm workers through processing, through the restaurant workers in the back of the house, have the highest levels of food insecurity and the highest levels of diet-related disease? The billion hungry people in the world mean that 1 in 7 people are going hungry. How can it be that in our country we reflect this statistic perfectly? 1 in 7 people going hungry. 1 in 7 people food insecure. And this after decades and decades of development. And this after the Green Revolution. And this after in the spread of industrial agriculture. And the modernization of our food systems. If we look back just 10, 15 years, we see a very disturbing pattern. We see an increase in food per capita, a steady increase in the amount of food for everybody, about 12% per capita per year. Every one of us should have gotten 12% more food this year than we had last year, and than we had the year before. And yet, if you look at the rates of poverty, they've remained the same. If you look at the rates of malnutrition, they've remained the same. So clearly, this isn't a problem of scarcity. This is a problem of injustice. Now some people will say, well, this is a problem of distribution, as if we didn't have enough distribution networks. Well, I've learned a few things on my visit to New York City, and I learned that the main port of distribution for food is where you have the largest food desert. And this is something that happens all around the world. Where is the largest food desert in the world? It's in the Midwest, where we produce most of our food. This isn't a problem of scarcity. We've got more than enough food to go around. If we look back through history, we started to measure the price of food with a food price index back in 1900. And what we see, looking back, is that the price of food has gone steadily down. Why? Because food is a commodity. And when you produce a lot of it, then the price drops. And since we've been producing more and more food, the price has been steadily dropping, with the exception of a few spikes when we have wars, when we have an oil crisis like in 1974. But basically, the price has gone steadily down. The world had cheap food until 2008. And in 2008, suddenly the price of food literally spikes off the chart, higher than anything we've ever seen since we started recording the price of food. Why? Well, there are a lot of suggestions about why this happened, but none of them had to do with scarcity. If we look in 2008, you see these graphs behind me, the price of food goes up, and then it drops back down. And then in 2011, it goes up again, and it's dropped back down again. But it never drops back down to where it was before. So the price of food is steadily rising now, contradicting a pattern which we've had for a century, in which the price of food was always dropping. Now the price of food is going up, steadily going up. It's very volatile, it goes up, it goes down, but it keeps on steadily moving upward. If you look at the red lines, the vertical lines on this graph, those are the incidences of food riots. So you can see that when the price of food gets above the food price index of around 190 or so, you begin to have food riots. People rebel because they're going hungry. Now in 2008, the food riots were in places you would expect them to be. Very poor countries where people were already very hungry. In the Caribbean, in Latin America, in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in a few places where you would never have expected them, like Italy or Milwaukee. So it clearly wasn't that there wasn't enough food to go around, but people couldn't afford the food. And these were called riots. But we stopped calling them riots when we looked a little more closely into things, and we looked at Haiti, for example. In Haiti, the situation was dire. People were already living on what they call mud biscuits. You take a little bit of lard and a little bit of clay, and you make a biscuit, and you put that in the oven, and that's what you eat. And now, traditionally, these have been used as a mineral supplement for women who were pregnant. It's a traditional mineral supplement. But people began to eat these biscuits in order to stave off hunger. But what did they do when they rioted? They didn't lay siege to the warehouse where the rice was kept. This is the USAID rice, which is given as a gift from the people of the United States in our PL 480 food program, when we give food away to, supposedly we give food away to hungry people. We actually give it to the governments. And the governments then sell that food at a cheap price to hungry people. That food was sitting in the warehouse. And they didn't break down the doors of the warehouse. They stormed the National Palace. And they drove the Prime Minister out of office and off the island. These were food rebellions. These were political rebellions against an unjust food system which was incapable of solving a very simple problem. Here's the food, here's the people. Why can't we just put them together? Well, they couldn't. Because the food was a commodity. It was part of a market. It was part of a political relationship with the United States. The second spike in 2011 of food prices has even more red lines. That's the Arab Spring. And in every single case of the rebellions in the Arab Spring, it started with a food riot. So this immediately caught the attention of world leaders. And they began to meet to decide what are we going to do about the food crisis. And the FAO basically said, look, you've got to reinvest about $40 billion into food production in the global south. And after a lot of hemming and hawing in several months, the G8 said, well, maybe we have about 22 billion we can invest. And less than 6% of that actually was invested. The point is, when we had these riots, we were producing more food than we ever had produced in the history of the world. We broke records in 2008 and in 2011. The oligopolies, monopolies which control our food system, the big grain companies, the big input companies, the big retailers, were making record profits at the time we have record hunger around the world and in the United States. This is because our food system responds to a very different logic. It's not a humanitarian logic. It's not a logic of fairness. It's not a logic of equity. It's not a logic of sustainability. If you look again at these graphs, you see the red line, in 2008, food price spike. It goes up and then it goes down, and it goes up again in 2011. And then you see a blue line. So the red line is what food costs in the international market. So the companies that make their money there are the companies that control the grain. ADM, Archer-Daniels Midlands, Cargill, Dreyfus, the big grain companies. That's where they made billions and billions of dollars when a billion people were going hungry. The blue line is what we pay for food in the store. That's the retail price index. So it follows the red line up, but then it holds flat. So that means when the price goes down in the international market, it stays high in the stores. And so that's where Walmart, Tesco, Carrefour, Safeway, all of these giant retailers made billions and billions of dollars by essentially extending the food crisis because they kept the price high. So the food crisis didn't go away just because the World Food Price Index dropped. It means that we have a permanent food crisis. And to see what this means for companies, take a look at the next graph, which looks a lot like the first graph, except it's not the food price index. It's the value of Monsanto's stock. Monsanto being a seed monopoly. So Monsanto's stock goes up as people go hungry. And Monsanto's stock goes down as people get access to more food. Now this is a big problem for Monsanto because they make tremendous profits in one moment, and then all of a sudden their shareholders start leaving them. And they're stuck with all this liquid capital, all this cash. What are they going to do with this cash? You have to reinvest it. This basically happened to all of the monopolies. They made windfall profits with the food crisis, and then they didn't know what to do with their money because we're in a recession. Where are you going to invest the money? Where are you going to put it? And if you don't put it somewhere, people are going to pull their stocks, their money out of your stocks. They're going to go somewhere else. So you have a crisis of accumulation. You've got to get rid of this money. What did they need? Well, they needed another food crisis. And they got it. Now, I'm not going to say that Monsanto engineered the food crisis. Other people have said that. But certainly, the next food crisis suited them very well, as it suited all of the monopolies very well. And now they're all talking about solving the food crisis. But we have to ask, solving it for whom? And which crisis are they really solving? Are they solving their own crisis of accumulation? Or are they solving the crisis of hunger? And I think that what we're seeing here, because of the fact that the food crisis is the hardest people of color in this, and on the global south, where most of the people of color live in the world, that we're seeing a racialized food system. And very often, this is difficult for people to see. It seems like a food system to which everyone has access. So how can it be racialized? But if you look at the construction of the food system over history, over the last few hundred years, you see, as Karen pointed out, this food system has always been based on oppression. It's always been based on the oppression of racial minorities in this country. It's always been based on exploitation. So it's not something that we want to fix and go back to something that we had before. Something we have to change completely. If we go back to the colonial food regime, starting in the 16th or 18th centuries, what we saw was that the European powers basically took food from the colonies and brought it back into Northern Europe, where they could sell it cheaply, because it was basically plunder. And by selling it cheaply, they were able to industrialize very cheaply. So food from the global south financed the industrialization and the development of the global north. And this was based on, of course, slavery, indentured servants, and later immigrant labor, in the case of the United States. And then the second stage of the food regime after World War II, what we see is that first the United States and then Europe begin to overproduce food, because what they do is they industrialize their food system. They industrialize their agriculture. With the excess of nitrates and poisons after the World War II, these were turned into industrial inputs, fertilizers, and pesticides. And we had a tremendous industrial capacity in the United States because we weren't bombed during the Second World War. So instead of producing tanks and jeeps, we started producing tractors and irrigation equipment. And so pretty soon we're overproducing food in the United States. And we're overproducing inputs. So luckily, in the first instance, we sell the food to Europe. It's trying to reconstruct after World War II. We loan them the money through the Marshall Plan, and we send them the food, and we rebuild Europe very quickly. And then Europe begins to overproduce food. And where does this food have to go? We can't eat it in the north. So the direction of food is reversed. Instead of going from the south to the north, it begins to go from the north to the south. But the people in the global south are already producing food. So what has to happen? The north has to destroy their food systems. And they did that through something we call development. Today, we have overproduction in the north, we have overproduction in the south, because we have 1.5 times enough food for everybody on the planet. But where is all of this overproduction supposed to go? Well, a lot of it goes into feedlots. And now we found another great place, cars. We can make ethanol and put it in cars. But why aren't we feeding hungry people? What's happening to all the farmers that got displaced as a result of the extension of industrial agriculture? After World War II, through a project called the Green Revolution, it was really a campaign financed by Ford and Rockefeller, who saw very clearly that farmers in the United States weren't going to be able to absorb any more machinery or any more petroleum or any more seeds. They'd saturated their market. So they began to sell these inputs to the global south. Now the global south had to take out loans in order to buy all of this. And they transferred the industrial model of food production from the north to the south. Well, the first thing that did was to displace millions and millions of peasant farmers. And where did they go? They went to the cities. They went to the hillsides, fragile hillsides, looking for land. They went into the agricultural frontier and had to chop down trees and clear land, trying to make a living. This is when we get what Mike Davis calls the planet of slums. The slums around the world in the global south begin to grow because of the displaced peasantry. The Green Revolution supposedly saved 1 billion people from hunger. But they created another 1 billion hungry people as a result. And who are these people? These are people of color, many of whom are here today because they were displaced. Because after that came structural adjustment and came the free trade agreements. And so the markets in these countries are destroyed and farmers can't make a living anymore. And so they're here. And where are they working? They're working in our food system. And in construction and in hospitality. But if you look at the food system in the United States today, who picks the crops? Former farmers, people of color. Who's in the processing plants? Former farmers, people of color. Who's working in the back of the house in the fancy restaurants? Former farmers, people of color. So we see that the structure of our food system, historically, is racist. So if we want a food system which doesn't displace people, which we want a food system in which the global south doesn't have to import $11 billion a year in food. They used to be self-sufficient in food. Global south used to produce $1 billion a year of food and export it back in the 70s. Now, thanks to 30 years of globalization, privatization, liberalization, the spread of unregulated markets, now they have to import their food. Industrial agriculture, which is spread around the world, uses up 80% of the world's water. It's incredibly inefficient. Yes, it produces a lot of food at a tremendous cost. We've lost 75% of our agrobiodiversity because so few varieties are planted. Greenhouse gases. The highest contributor to greenhouse gases is industrial agriculture. So we produce this food at tremendous social and environmental cost. And even though we've increased the amount of food per capita by about 11%, as the graph I showed before indicated, the number of hungry people has also increased by 11%. We're getting nowhere in terms of ending hunger. But that's because hunger is a big business. In the food system today, the contradictions of our economic system are become patently obvious. This crisis of accumulation, of making so many massive profits off the volatility of the prices in food, of the volatility in the market in general, means that the entire world has a crisis of accumulation. Where to put all these profits when we're in the middle of a recession? People aren't buying anything. It doesn't make sense to start more factories. So they're putting it in land. Billions of dollars are going into land. And these land deals, these large-scale land acquisitions, as the World Bank loves to call them, are land grabs. Because people are being dispossessed around the world. Something like 88 million acres of land has been grabbed worldwide. It's very hard to tell. These are very shady deals, usually between very large investors, for example, Goldman Sachs or our pension funds, or the government of South Korea, which go and basically access land which supposedly is extra land, wasteland, rangeland. People are living there. People are making their livings there. And they're being dispossessed. And in the United States, we have the financialization of our farmland, but right now, our farms are worth more for what they can be traded on in the international financial markets than for what they produce. So that's why it's so hard to access land in this country. Because the value of land has been inflated, horribly inflated. And so we see land grabs in a different way here. While land grabs may be 500 acres and up around the world, here you don't necessarily see them, but it's happening. We have large grabs, small grabs, financial grabs. And of course, this is what's driving gentrification as well, which makes it so hard for folks who are trying to grow their own food because the food system isn't working for them, because the food system is poisoning them, because they don't have access to healthy food. Now they're not getting access to the land that they need to grow the food, even if it's just a quarter of an acre in the middle of the city. So if we want to talk about food, we have to talk about land in this country. We have to talk about property in this country. And the inequitable distribution of property in this country. And I think that we also have to talk about the loss of the public sphere. Because by the time the land is lost, by the time the food system, the local food system is lost, by the time control over one's own diet is lost, it's the public sphere which has been lost. And by that I mean the relationships, the civic and social and cultural relationships which hold our communities together, which protect us from the volatility of the market, which protect us from violence in our society, which protect us from lack of educational services or lack of health and education and welfare services. As our services disappear, so disappears our public sphere. Our public goods begin to be sold off, and we can't stop them because, in fact, the relationships between people are also being invaded with the privatization of everything. So some time back, we used to get scholarships. Some time back, you didn't have to worry about going bankrupt if you went to the hospital. We had social protections, we had public goods. And there were relationships in our communities which helped to hold these in place. One of the strongest relationships in our public sphere is the PTA, the Parent-Teacher Association. Everybody cared, and everybody came to talk about how we were going to run our public schools. And now that we've undermined the foundations of our public school system, we also lose the PTAs. We also lose those relationships. And of course, we shouldn't be surprised then that we see an increase in police violence in underserved communities. We shouldn't be surprised that we see an increase in unemployment, and educational facilities and health facilities are absolutely insufficient. So we're in a catch-22 now, where we need to recover control over our food system at a time when our public sphere is also under attack. And I think that the good news for society in general is that people are trying to take back the public sphere. People are trying to rebuild these community relationships, which are essentially a commons, where we not only have the same rights, but we have the same power. Now, we have the same rights in the market. We can buy and sell and go bankrupt without any discrimination there. Everybody can go bankrupt, right? Yeah, but who gets to go bankrupt? Who finally ends up going bankrupt? That's where we see the differences in power. In a commons, everybody has the same amount of power, and we don't let anybody else go bankrupt because we depend on each other. And if you think about the different types of commons, the social commons, the intellectual commons, this is a glue which holds our communities together. And this is the glue that we need if we expect to turn our food system into something which actually serves society rather than the financial sector and the monopolies. Well, we're up against some pretty large problems. The last 30 years of globalization have basically created the largest levels of inequality in the history of the world, where 85 people own half of the world's wealth. That can't possibly be sustainable or equitable. So, I want to focus again on the public sphere because where we see it beginning to come back the resurgence of our public sphere comes back through social movements. So some of the strongest social movements in the world today are the women's movement and the food movement. And particularly within the food movement, we see the food movement for food sovereignty worldwide. Now this is basically a peasant movement of the peasantry, which is being displaced around the world, is fighting back. And so Via Campesina has, which is an international peasant federation advancing food sovereignty, has over 200 million members. And they're calling for the democratization of the food system in favor of the poor. They're calling for changing the rules, changing the institutions. They want food out of the World Trade Organization. They don't want to treat it as an unregulated commodity. They want redistribution of land. They don't want to see land continue to concentrate through the market and through land grabs. They want to be able to control their own food systems. In the United States, what we've seen is a tremendous spread of food assistance programs, anti-hunger programs, people engaging in any way they can with local, state, and federal governments to try to solve the emergencies which we see in underserved communities of food and health. And of course, these programs are insufficient because our social services, our educational services, service of health, education, welfare, have all been cut back, are all disappearing. And so philanthropy has sort of stepped up the plate and tried to fill in where the government is not doing its job anymore. And of course, there isn't enough money in philanthropy to solve the food crisis in the United States. And so we have also a lot of great initiatives that people should vote with their fork. They should buy food according to their values. They should send a message to the market that we want healthy, organic food, so we're only going to buy that food. We want local food, so we're going to buy that food. Well, that's great if you have money. But if you don't have money, you can't really vote with your fork. A friend of mine says, the problem with voting with your fork is that in many neighborhoods, there are no polling stations. Sure, people would like to be able to vote, would like to be able to buy food in accordance with their values, but they can't afford it. So they have to buy the cheap food, the lousy food, the food which is making us all sick. We should eat according to our values, but that's not enough. Because most people who are hungry can't. They're hungry because they're poor. We should eat locally. But that's not enough, because then we have to ask, well, who gets to eat locally? And who gets to produce locally? And how is that food produced? I think one of the very promising movements within the food movement is the food justice movement. Because the food justice movement is addressing precisely these contradictions, addressing precisely these questions. And the history of the food justice movement is very rich and very old. It's basically coming from the racial justice movements, the prison abolition movement, economic justice movements, coming together around food. Why food? Because food is so essential, and because we can't come together around it. And what we see, of course, is who are most negatively affected by this food system. It's people of color, people from underserved communities. These are for whom changing the food system is not an option. It's not a hobby. It's not a pastime. It's a matter of survival. And this is why this is the strongest and most reliable trend within the food movement itself. So we might not see celebrity food writers in the food justice movement. We might see a few. We might not see this movement writing in the New York Times or publishing books. But they're there. They're everywhere. in the United States, in both rural and urban areas, and growing and facing tremendous difficulties, and yet refusing to disappear. I like to look back at the Black Panther Party and the lessons of the Black Panther Party in the food justice movement, which has been invisibilized in the larger food movement to a great degree. I think we cannot afford to ignore the lessons of the Black Panther Party, who started a food breakfast program for children and fed 250,000 kids every day, without a penny from the government, without a penny from philanthropy. They did it with the support of the community. Now, it's important to understand that back in the 60s, before this wave of neoliberal globalization and privatization swept around the world and into our country, there were a lot more black-owned businesses who could contribute. In other words, there was a much richer economic and civic society in underserved communities and communities of color. They held more wealth, and so were able to contribute, to take care of those in the community who needed it. And the Panthers figured out how to do this. But the Panthers also knew, which I think is essential for the food movement to realize, that food was simply one plank in a platform of liberation. Because they also asked, in their 10-point platform, they asked for jobs, education, an end to police violence, among other things. And I think the fetishism of the larger food movement or the good food movement today is that we think that we can change the food system in isolation of all the other oppressions. I think this is very dangerous thinking. I don't think it's possible at all. I think that the last half century should show us that that's not possible. So that means that we need very strong alliances if we're serious about changing the food system. And because it is a racialized food system, and because it is a food system built on oppression historically, it's not about fixing it. It's about transforming it. And for that we need extremely powerful social movements. And so how are we going to come together as a food movement, diverse as we are? Well, we're going to have to address the reasons why we're so separated, why we're so fragmented. And Michael Pollan likes to talk about the food movement. He says that it's a fragmented movement. Well, it's also a stratified movement. There are some people who get to talk for everybody. Mm-hmm. And other people doing the work. There are some people who get the land. And other people who don't. There are some people who get to be viewed as entrepreneurs. And other people who have to scratch and ask for donations. I think Karen was very clear about who those people are. And I think that if we're serious about changing this movement, we have to address the issue of privilege within the food system. And we have to address the issue of privilege within the food movement. So that means we have to address white privilege. And specifically male white privilege. Now, this isn't easy. I mean, racism has been around since the beginning of capitalism. It has quite a head start. And a horrendous legacy which has left a tremendous amount of historical trauma. And white privilege is not exempt from this trauma. White folks who are concerned about these issues feel a lot of guilt and shame and powerlessness. And that's understandable. But we have to find a way through it. Otherwise, we can never be good allies. We can never form strong alliances with people of color. And we can't ask them to do this for us. They've got a lot to do already. They're dealing with direct oppression They're dealing with structural racism, direct racism, the rise of violence. So I think that the food justice movement is pivotal in changing our food system, because it's in the food justice movement where we are most committed to addressing these issues and forming these strong alliances. So, what do we need to do? I'm not going to tell us all what we have to do, but I am going to say why it's important. And I hope I can indicate why we should still be hopeful that this can be done. If we build these alliances, we're going to have to begin to control exchange. We're going to need to control the market and not have the market control us, because the way it controls us, we know what happens. It works against underserved communities and communities of color. We're going to have to talk about redistributive land justice. Now, it's very difficult to do in this country. But we are losing our land to the financial markets as we speak. And if we don't begin to talk about land and how we're going to protect it and redistribute it, we're going to lose complete control over it. You know, in the 1970s, we had a terrible farm crisis in this country. We lost half of our farms because there's tremendous overproduction around the world and our farmers went out of business. So the first farmers to lose their land were African American farmers. Why? Because they were so vulnerable to the market. And because the USDA didn't step in to help. The USDA didn't step up. The USDA stepped back and let African American farmers lose their land. And white farmers, for the most part, sat back and watched. Why? Because they thought they were going to buy the land. Well, some did. But it wasn't too much longer. 5 years later, they were losing their land. And so we lost half of our farmers. We went from 4 to 2% of our population in farming. We have more people in jail now than we have on the land. So it would have been essential to form a strong alliance if we didn't want to lose land at all in the first place. And why didn't it happen? It happened because of racism. So that's why it's so important to dismantle racism if we're going to talk about land or any other of the resources in our food system. We desperately need labor and immigration reform. I mean, the immigration question is a labor question. Immigrants are basically kept without documents because that way their labor will be cheap and they can be exploited. And wages in general will be held down. That's the conversation we need to have. And we have to stop oppression in the communities. We have to stop police violence. And we have to find ways to begin to heal historical trauma in underserved communities. And communities of color and communities of privilege have to address the trauma as well. Black Lives Matter and the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, Food Chain Workers Alliance, the branch workers here in the New York area who package all the food, by the way, talk about transformational solidarity. In other words, our communities of color realize very clearly that we do need to form alliances, that we do need solidarity, that if we're going to change this, we do have to work together. But it's not any kind of alliance. It's not any kind of solidarity. Because we don't just want reforms to go back to the way things used to be before liberalization. We need to transform not just the food system. We need to transform our relationships. We need to transform our economy. We need to transform the food movement, and we need to transform ourselves. So, I just want us to recognize and respect the hope and the goodwill which the food justice movement is trying to build, and the ways in which the food justice movement is trying to build our public sphere again from the ground up. And I think that if we're going to do this, we need to have a shared vision, a transformational vision, which works for everybody, and which prioritizes those who are most damaged by the current food system. So what would a food system look like if food workers were food secure? What would our food system look like if farm workers received decent living wages and had decent working conditions? What would our food system look like if women were recognized as producers of 70% of the world's food? And what would our food system look like if Black Lives mattered? I think these are the questions that we have to ask. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric and Karen, for two very compelling and moving presentations. I would just like to make a couple of points briefly, and then I think it would be best to open it up for discussion and questions. The first sort of overarching point is that Karen Washington started off talking mainly about food movements and the need to bring into being a different kind of food movement with a different kind of leadership, with different sensibilities. And Eric Holt Jimenez was talking, at least initially, mainly about the food system. Okay, now these are overlapping, but not completely the same things. But I think what's also interesting is to point to some of the links between these things that each speaker indicated. Karen's talk had, I think, a very succinct and great analysis of what happens in neighborhoods that have been abandoned by the powers that be, devastated by the powers that be, and where there are empty lots available that people then, through lots and lots of difficult work, turn into beautiful gardens. And then the neighborhoods start to become attractive, and then people with more money move in, and a gentrification process ensues. And then you begin to get the city auctioning off these lots, because in New York, certainly abandoned buildings, abandoned lots eventually end up as city property, and the city can do this. She didn't say a whole lot about the next step, but I'm guessing that you could, which is that speculators come in and buy this land and sometimes hold it for quite long periods of time. I was very familiar with this process on the Lower East Side in the 70s when something similar happened to the area between, say, Avenue B and Avenue D. Lots of empty lots, speculators getting hold of it, hanging on to it for a really long time, and then making a killing. And Karen said the system's not broken, it's intentional. And I think this is really where we have to look, that the system, it's not that the system is bad for everybody, it's not bad for everybody. There are sectors that benefit and depend on and work very hard to reproduce the system as it is because it serves their interests. So I think to look at this analytically, we need to think about what those interests are, who is benefiting and who is not. And it's not always so simple to see that. One of the links, I think, between these two presentations precisely concerns this notion of empty land or underutilized land or empty lots, as we might call it in urban contexts. The land grab that Eric referred to is often talked about in terms of farmland, and certainly that's very important. But there are also very significant land grabs in the United States, in India, and many other places that are essentially land grabs on the urban periphery or even within cities. Land being bought not so much for farmland, but for urbanization, for shopping malls, for tourism, very importantly. So there are a number of dynamics to this, but there are connections too in terms of the problems that these create of displacement, of hunger many times. Eric mentioned a statistic that I think really is very sobering, which is that 1/7 of the world population is hungry. We know that, but also that 1/7 of the US population is hungry. And this is something that is maybe not as always in consciousness in this country. And it seems to generate surprisingly little outrage. To have 1/7 of the people in a society hungry means that that society is in an emergency situation. It's like having the house on fire or something like that, but nobody is sort of working hard, outraged, trying to put out that particular fire. I'm reminded in thinking about this particular problem in this country that the United States is the one powerful, developed country that at the international level does not believe that there is a right to food. The right to food is an accepted principle of international law, accepted by almost every country in the world. It's not accepted by our country. And I knew this, and I was in a forum in Washington about a year ago, and there's somebody from the State Department there, very congenial, very nice person, as some of these people are. But when you would sit down and talk about what the official position of the United States was, he said, "There's no right to. We don't recognize any right to food. That doesn't exist." And in the coffee break, I approached him. I said, I asked him, "How do you feel saying that kind of thing? I mean, isn't it a little bit? You seem like a nice person. Isn't that a little embarrassing to have to say that in front of this audience?" And he just turned around and walked away. So I think one area that we could insist on is that food be treated as a human right, that it's a universal entitlement, and that in this country that our government recognize that as a human right. I was also struck by Eric's observation that food deserts are located often in the same places as hubs of production and distribution. And I'm fairly familiar with that situation in the Bronx and the Hunts Point area. I worked for a while in Longwood, which is right next to Hunts Point. And you can see the logic of it there, because it was an area, and it connects to this logic of there being empty lots. It's an area where land prices by New York City standards are somewhat low. They had to move this big packing facility in somewhere, so they sited it in that area. There's so many things that connects to. The failure to have a new rail line under the Hudson River, which we can thank Governor Christie for, that would have cut down on the vehicle traffic to Hunts Point very substantially, that worsens the air quality in our city, the ramifications of food-related stuff emanate out in so many different, very, very troubling ways. But I was hoping and thinking about that connection between food deserts and hubs of production and distribution, if Eric maybe at some point could say a little more about the Midwest that he mentioned as being sort of characteristic of this, because that's a case I know less. The other thing I thought maybe could be drawn out a little bit from one of those graphs that Eric showed. This graph of food prices where it goes way up in 2008, comes down, goes way back up in 2011, and there's this big dip, and then the retail price just goes down a little bit and stays almost level for that time, creating bigger profits for the monopolies. I think this is part of a bigger problem, which is that your basic, unprocessed, healthier foods tend not to be worth very much per unit weight. The famous problem of the handful of corn cost pennies being turned into the $6 box of cornflakes is maybe the emblematic case here. And so I think what's going on, it's not just that the processed food is being almost forced on people and that there are lack of alternatives. That's part of this dynamic of the profit in food being precisely in the processing end of it. It's not so much the bushel of corn, it's the skid packed with cornflakes or whatever. That's where the profit is. So that's what's being foisted on people. There are many things that these talks stimulate me to say, but I just want to say a few more things about this issue of democratizing the food system. We can't disconnect this from the problem of democratizing the whole society. The United States goes around the world very self-importantly, proclaiming itself to be the model of democracy, going to war in order to bring democracy to poor benighted peoples in dozens of places around the world. And we don't even have direct election for President of the United States. We have a Senate where Wyoming, with a population of 500,000 people, has 2 senators, and California, Texas, and New York each have 2 senators. So the Wyoming voter in the Senate has vastly more power than I do through his elected senator. What does this mean in terms of the issue of food and agriculture? Well, one of the things it means is that even though we have this minuscule population of people who are actually farmers in this country, and a somewhat larger portion of people who are connected in one way or another to agriculture, but it's a small percentage. The industrial agriculture lobbies are hugely popular, I meant to say hugely influential, and are influential partly because of the outsized influence of representatives in states where agribusiness is very important, being directly or indirectly in their pay. So we have export subsidies to dump food in other countries. We have the ethanol subsidy to uselessly convert a huge portion of the maize that is produced in this country into ethanol. We have all of these subsidies to basically to agribusiness. Tiny little pieces of it go to the smaller family farms that remain, but the lion's share goes to large agribusiness. And these subsidies exist thanks to the undemocratic nature, not just of the food system, but of the entire political system. And it's not just our US, North American problem. Many years ago, I had a farmer in Costa Rica say to me, we can produce rice probably as well as they produce rice in California, But what we can't compete with is we can't compete with the Treasury of the United States. And what he meant was the growers of rice in the United States were receiving subsidies to dump rice in Central America, and that they couldn't compete with the subsidies. They thought if the playing field were really level, they could probably do okay. But the inequalities are at the north-south level, they're within the north. The global north, as I'm constantly telling students, is not about riches, it's about riches and poverty and what's in between also. I think, at the risk, it's easy looking at the power that's arrayed against the progressive, more explicitly political parts of the food movement to see how unequal the fight really is. But I think, Eric's talk was great in celebrating some victories that have occurred. And he mentioned the experience of the Black Panthers in the 60s and into the 70s with starting school breakfast programs for kids. This happened in New York also with the Young Lords organization in East Harlem. If one looks now with the benefit of hindsight, when I take my youngest kid to his New York City public school, he can get breakfast there every day, and it's considered a completely normal and acceptable thing. But nobody remembers where that came from. That wasn't a normal thing 40 or 50 years ago. That was something that had to be won through concerted struggle by lots of people, and great sacrifice by lots of people. So I'll stop there and let's hear comments, questions for our speakers.
Can I just say, look, I just want to just bring a point home, and I don't want to offend anyone, but throughout the conversation, and I'm just talking from my perspective and my friend's perspective of people of color, that we have to be very careful about the terms that we use to describe what's happening in our neighborhoods. And I know a lot of people use the term food deserts. And that's a conversation we have all the time, especially in low-income neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color, that we don't like that term because it's a term that was not used in our neighborhoods. It seems like it's a term that was used from outsiders to sort of map certain areas because we like to really say what it is in its hunger and poverty. Because when you say food desert, it really doesn't get at the heart of the problem, and the problem is hunger and poverty. Another thing I want to talk about in terms of, again, from the perspective of the people in my neighborhood, is job creation, because there's a correlation between food and economics. And we've had this conversation before. I know a lot of people have heard me say this before about the enabling food system that we have in terms of the food stamps and soup kitchens and food pantry, which is all well and good, especially in a country with so much wealth. Why do we have these programs? But they were supposed to be emergency programs. They're supposed to be Band-Aids, and that's supposed to be programs that are dealt with year after year and time after time. And what I'm hearing from the people in my neighborhood and the people across the country in low-income neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color, we need economic development, and that means jobs. Because if you have a job, a living wage job with benefits, you can then buy food. You can then feed your family. You can then buy a house. You can then do things. And when you have money, you can buy land, and you can have a job, and you can create a business. Owning land and having a business is powerful. And so that's what we want to hear if people want to come into our neighborhood, not to come in to fix it, not to come as parachutists and to fix the problem because we know what the problem is. What we want is for people to come in with their resources, to come in and do job creation and also financial literacy. And I say that also because it doesn't make sense to put in money if people don't know how to manage their finance. And so the next step that I want to see in this food movement is for people to come into our neighborhoods with job creation, but not in terms of loaning us money, giving us money, but also in terms of being self-sufficient, self-reliant, and to really foster entrepreneurship. Again, owning a business, owning something gives you power. Owning your food system, owning land, owning your house gives you power. And so those are the mechanisms that I know so many of us want to hear when it comes to the food system, because there's a correlation between food, economics, and health. And I think for too long, the system, which is not sustainable, the emphasis, especially in the health system, is money, billions and billions of dollars, always being placed on the treatment and not on the prevention. And so food, health, and economics, they're all intertwined. And so what I want to hear from people, and what I want to see from people is in terms of economic development, so that we have jobs, so that we can start owning things, and we can buy food that is local, culturally appropriate, and all those things. But we need that emphasis on economic development and viability. I just have to say that.
Thank you. Questions, comments?
Y'all better say something. We've talked about dismantling racism, and y'all need to speak up, because again, silence is bad. Silence and complacency. You have to have something. This is dismantling racism in the food system. You have to have questions or thoughts about it.
Yes.
Yeah, a couple of them. Myself, I'm from Brussels, Europe, so I look at it from a very different perspective, I guess. But some of the discussions we are having are similar, and I was wondering from what you were saying earlier, Karen, about the beautification that you were doing back in the time, and then seeing what process of beautification. We still have that discussion going on, and I was wondering if you kind of abandoned the idea of beautification at all, or how you are dealing with that. It's because it's an ongoing discussion within the movement we're having. And also something totally different, but I was wondering when listening to Eric's talk, and I have heard it before this week, where in the context of the US, because I understand you're really talking about the US food movement. Even though it was not always explicit, so sometimes I feel it may become dangerous also if you're gonna, as an answer to a current global corporate regime, food regime, coming with answers that are supposedly global for me. That's not the case. When we're talking about visioning, for example, so I was wondering if you had some more ideas on that, and in particular, also with regard to the US, I was also wondering where are the indigenous peoples within this story that you represent?
So when you talk about the beautification of the empty lots, let's bring it to the forefront. Nobody wanted to live in an area where there was garbage, crack, drugs at that time, and also prostitution and high levels of violence. So when communities got together, and it wasn't about food first, it was about beautification, about survival. So back in the early 80s and late 1970s, in this sort of food movement, it wasn't food movement, and reclaiming land, it was for survival. It was for survival, and through that survival came beautification, to make something that was detrimental, that looked ugly, into something that was beautiful. And as a result of the beauty, it started to all of a sudden, the whole complexion of the neighborhood started to look different, and so developers started to come and see, well, wow, the neighborhood doesn't look as bad, and outsiders started to come in and say, oh, the neighborhood doesn't look so bad. And what has happened through the years is that people have forgotten the history. They have forgotten the history of what it took to change and transform those neighborhoods. And as a result, they look appealing, and now you have outsiders that are coming in and displacing people who have been in those communities for 30, 40 years, displacing them because all of a sudden the neighborhood now looks attractive. And so we don't have those conversations around history. We don't have those conversations about what it does when new people come in with wealth and displace people who've been there 20 and 30, 40 years. And that's a conversation we don't have when it comes to gentrification. It doesn't happen. It seems like people just, they see a neighborhood that looks good, the rents are low, and they can come in and they can pay those rents without having that conversation within the community, what they're coming in is going to do in terms of displacement. It is happening now, it will continue to happen now, but I tell people, we're in the Bronx, we're the last borough standing, and we are at the bridges, preventing it from crossing over. We're gonna do our darnest to prevent it.
Yes.
I don't know if I understood your question completely. The food movement in the United States has a lot of moving parts. What I was trying to say was that for me, the axis around which the food movement truly revolves is the food justice movement, which is anchored, of course, by the needs and demands and the ingenuity of people of color. I think that if it wasn't for that, the food movement in the United States would be an extremely shallow thing, a fad at best, and would be benefiting very, very few people. I mean, and that's why I made the point of looking at the roots of the food justice movement, going back to the demands of liberation, of black liberation, of the Black Panther Party. I think that those lessons need to be taken up by other parts of the food movement and the food justice movement. And in regards, I don't think that there's any fear in that regard of talking about the food justice movement. On the contrary, I think that the food justice movement is becoming increasingly bold because it has to. Otherwise, it gets ignored. Otherwise, it gets passed over. Otherwise, the land goes somewhere else, the resources go somewhere else, the money for entrepreneurism goes somewhere else. And so I actually think that it's, we pay attention to, we need to pay attention to that. Regarding the indigenous people in this country, clearly the history of indigenous peoples has been one of dispossession and genocide and for the resources. And so today, when one talks about food sovereignty rather than food justice, very often the first people who latched onto that term in this country were indigenous people. Because they knew very well they weren't going to get justice from the American government. This is a fairly obvious historical lesson for indigenous people. So they weren't about getting food justice, they were about food sovereignty. And just as in the global south, it's very much about food sovereignty. And there are lots of dimensions to this, but I think that the clarity around the term sovereignty has been much stronger in the indigenous peoples within the food movement than in other. It's spoken more clearly to indigenous people. And I also think that one of the contributions from indigenous peoples to the task of dismantling racism, and particularly in addressing internalized oppression in oppressed communities, is that of historical trauma. There's been a tremendous amount of work done by indigenous people to heal themselves from historical trauma. And I think we have that it's essential that we learn from that experience. Because as long as we're traumatized, whether we're part of a target population